Hi, I'm Jeff Snowden, running for Place 4 on the Frisco ISD's Board of Trustees.
And my name is Brian Powell, and I'm running for Place 5 on Frisco ISD Board of Trustees.
Welcome to this, our presentation on how we would propose to address Frisco ISD's financial concerns through fiscal year 2020. How did we get here? In 2016, the FISD Board was presented with a 4-year budget forecast, which, based on assumptions, resulted in a $93 million budget deficit. Instead of challenging those assumptions, the FISD Board chose to adopt a budget which entailed a 13-cent tax increase, the maximum amount allowed by law. This tax increase, if approved by the voters, would have generated $163 million through 2020.
Essentially, the board asked taxpayers for a tax increase that was $70 million more than they needed to fund their budget deficit. This tax was rejected overwhelmingly by the taxpayers.
What were the missed opportunities from our perspective? Number one, realistic assumptions on the revenue growth of the FISD from now through 2020.
The other missed opportunities we're going to put in 3 buckets. The first bucket was no consideration of cost savings and uplift in non-tax revenue. The second bucket was no consideration of excess revenue generated under existing INS tax rate, i.e. a tax swap. The third is no consideration of the excess taxpayer cash that we have on hand. And we'll talk about each one of these buckets in more detail coming up.
Revenue growth. Folks, we are blessed with tremendous economic development here in Frisco. You don't have to look far to see the building and construction and valuation added to our tax rolls every year. In fact, over the last 10 years, we've added an average annual 9% increase to our revenues at FISD. When staff developed the budget forecast which drove this tax increase, they applied a 2% average annual growth to our revenue. 2%. We ran the numbers. Even if I divide the historically observed 9% average annual growth in half and apply 4.5% revenue growth through 2020, we have just eliminated the $93 million budget. That's right. Our cash revenue will be more than sufficient to fund operations, to fund small classrooms, fairly compensate our teachers easily through 2020 without any increase in our tax rate. Now let's talk about our buckets. Bucket number 1, cost savings and non-tax rate revenue. Okay, I was a part of a stakeholder committee that was convened in late 2016, made up of 28 individuals, 14 FISD staff, 14 non-FISD staff. We looked at all the numbers and came up with a series of recommendations on how to cut costs and raise revenues without raising taxes. That group, which I was honored to be a part of, generated recommendations exceeding $20 million per year. Even when we cut out any recommendation which affects our classroom or our teachers, we're still left with $11 million per year of revenue enhancements and cost savings. Times 4 years, folks, that's $44 million in recommendations from this committee that could assist FISD through 2020.
The second bucket is restructuring the existing tax rate we already have, i.e. a tax swap. So basically, Frisco ISD has 2 buckets that they tax citizens. The first is M&O, and the second is the INS fund. Right now, the INS fund, at its current tax rate, generates around $55 million more revenue than we need to cover our debt service through 2020. If we offset or defer a few projects by 2 years, this surplus increases to $77 million. We could simply ask the voters for an 8-cent TRE and then lower our INS rate by 8 cents, so our net effective tax increase is 0, and we could fully fund a majority of the budget deficit with no overall tax increase. The third bucket is the excess taxpayer cash on hand. Right now, the district has $396 million of cash on hand, which $156 million of that is unrestricted, meaning we can use it. We're required for bond rating purposes to hold 60 days of cash on hand to cover expenses for a 60-day period. Right now, FISD has 112 days of cash on hand. If we're conservative and we say we want to hold 90 days of cash on hand to cover operating expenses, we still have cash in excess of $39 million in cash and investments that could be used to offset budget deficits. If anybody tells you that this doesn't happen or it can't happen, 3 times in the last 10 years, FISD has drawn down this surplus cash in order to cover operating costs. So it can be done, and we have the money to do it.
In summary, again talking about revenue escalations, we've grown our revenue increase each year on average by 9%. Staff applied a 2% increase per year through 2020, generating a huge deficit, which triggered a tax increase that would have resulted in the maximum tax rate allowed by Texas law. Voters rejected this. Even if we apply half of the observed history of 4.5% to our revenue growth, we will eliminate any deficit through 2020.
And then talking about the buckets that we have, FISD can use any combination of the three buckets we talked about without raising taxes or impacting the classrooms, which means teachers and students. The first bucket, being conservative, could generate $44 million that the stakeholder committee came up. And this was, as Jeff mentioned, a combination of people, citizens and people within the district. The second bucket, a conservative value, is $54 million, and that's simply done by swapping INS money to M&O, so the net increase is zero. The third bucket is basically liquidity we have on hand. Again, a conservative estimate holding 90 days of cash on hand, we have in excess of $39 million. When you add all three of these buckets up, you have $137 million, which is much larger than the deficit that's projected of $93 million. You add that in combination to what Jeff talked about on the assumptions that were made in the budget, and we can fully fund our budget through 2020 without raising taxes one penny.
Folks, the numbers presented tonight represent tremendous opportunities to expand upon Frisco's reputation as having the best schools in North Texas and throughout the country. We need to focus these revenue opportunities that we have identified on driving those funds into the classroom and giving our teachers the resources they need to excel and exceed at their chosen profession.
Remember, your vote is your voice. Vote for Brian Powell and Jeff Snowden for Frisco ISD Board of Trustees. Thank you for your time.